Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Scottish University Press Fireside event. It is the third in a series of events that we've been running, and it marks the launch of a new title, The Vow of Stability, an Ethnography of Monastic Life by Richard Irvine. Today, we're going to welcome colleagues and readers from different academic backgrounds and from across different institutions. It's great always to see many registrations and the interest generally as another exciting scholarly work is published. This book enters us into the world of monastic life and explores various themes throughout its chapters, like endurance and community and social dynamics, all through an anthropological lens. This book will be of interest to academic departments of anthropology and theology, religious studies, but also will be of interest and an engaging read for many, and is openly accessible to facilitate a wide audience. Scottish Universities Press, or SUP, as you might hear us say from time to time, is a fully open access and not-for-profit press. The model provides a clear and cost-effective route for researchers to make their work freely available to a global audience, extending the impact of research across society. It's been developed by 20 university libraries working together through SCURL, that's the Scottish Confederation of University and Research Libraries, and we're excited to support the launch of this latest SUP book, which is now available openly and freely to download in both EPUB and PDF formats. You can do that from sup.ac.uk. It's also available in print formats. Whilst there's a lot of activity across libraries that goes into making SUP successful, it is of course our academic colleagues who are writing the books and giving their time to our editorial board and to be peer reviewers. We're very grateful to authors who choose SUP and pleased to see their work reach publication day and make its way into the world. And that's the case for the book that we're discussing today, published just 2 days ago. And I'm delighted to have the author Richard Irvine with us here today. But let me do some brief introductions then before we get started properly. So Richard Irvine is a senior lecturer and director of teaching in social anthropology at the University of St Andrews. His work spans the anthropology of religion and environmental anthropology, and he's carried out fieldwork in the UK and Mongolia. He's previously published an anthropology of deep time, asking at what temporal resolution should we view human activity. And we're really delighted to have Richard here with us today. I should also introduce myself. I'm Hannah Whaley. I'm chair of the management board for Scottish Universities Press. I'm also the university librarian at the University of Dundee and director of library, academic and cultural services here. I'm joined by my colleague Gillian Daly, who is the executive officer of SCURL and press manager for SUP. This is the third fireside event that Gillian and I have hosted, so our armchairs beside the fire are feeling quite cozy and worn in by now. And the first two conversations are available to view on the SUP YouTube channel, which actually we can pop a link to in the chat. In those sessions, we discuss other recently published books, conversations with Tim Ingold, and digital editing and publishing in the 21st century. And those may be of interest to any of our anthropology or library publishing colleagues that are in the audience today. But we are discussing a brand new title at this event, one which looks at the daily rhythms and rituals of monks in a Catholic English Benedictine monastery, while also examining this in relation to the broader history of monasticism and its corresponding institutions. There's a fantastic blog post that's been published by St Andrews, and we can drop a link to that as well. And also note the support of St Andrews Library in publishing this book, and also the wider SUP involvement in cataloguing and supporting the discoverability of our titles as well. Richard's writing draws on long-term anthropological fieldwork in a Catholic English Benedictine monastery, which, as the title suggests, brings into focus the vow of stability, the promise of stability, and what it takes to sustain that shared life within the rhythms, the environment and fabric of everyday life. It's been remarked that this fieldwork is unique in the literature, which makes this an interesting but also timely and relevant conversation to have. There are challenging topics within this, including sexual abuse allegations and convictions, which I wanted to mention may be discussed within our conversations today from an academic and research perspective, but so that our audience are aware. Our conversation today will let us see behind the book, looking at inspirations and challenges and key takeaways from writing and the creation of the text, as well as insights into monastic communities, how religious institutions evolve and persist through generations, and the complex social commitment of Benedictine monks within their daily lives. So we definitely have an interesting hour planned, but before we delve in, one last thing I'll do is just outline the format of today and how everybody that's watching can get involved as well. So we'll start by exploring the publishing process with some questions about that, and then we'll guide a conversation about the contents of the book itself. We're including a live Q&A within this, and we'll keep turning to audience questions and bringing them into the discussion. We'll use questions that were submitted during registration and throughout the Q&A over the course of the event. So please do take this as a call, start thinking of questions now, and feel free to post them. We'll aim to get through as many as possible. There's a chat function available throughout the event for informal exchanges, and we'll put links in there that might be of interest or to alert us to any issues, to alert us as hosts to any issues. But there's also a Q&A button in Zoom that you can use to submit questions to the panel directly. So I think that's all housekeeping about the running of the event. Without any further delay, I'll jump onto questions if I can, Richard. And my first one is to ask why it was important for you to make this work open access.
Thanks very much for having me. Well, the main reason that I wanted to make sure that this book was open access is, I was recently director of teaching in anthropology at St Andrews. The importance of students being able to read full-length ethnographies is really important for anthropology, and I think it's something that's increasingly hard to do within a framework where more and more readings are being broken down into these kind of bite-sized chunks. And in particular, I think one of the things that's driving that is the fact that there is an uneven access to book-length ethnographies, and in that context, there are copyright concerns. Okay, I can only share a certain number of chapters with this, a temptation to sort of go for shorter forms because of that. So if you want to really say to students, look, it's really important that you immerse yourself in book-length ethnographies, you need to also make sure that there is that evenness of access. I've just come back from working out in Mongolia and giving lectures at the National University of Mongolia there, and there's obviously a context there where how much budget do you really have to get all of these English language publications out there? And so as I'm talking, I can see that the students are starting to download the pirated PDFs and things, and so that the system's broken at that point. So it's like, okay, well, what can we do to restore that system to something of sanity and to make sure that people have access to full-length ethnographies?
That's an excellent point, and really well made for everyone to kind of keep in mind that when we talk about open access, it is something that is quite it's global in terms of the provision when something is made openly available in that way. Can I ask why SUP in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, when I heard about SUP a couple of years ago, and when the call was put out for manuscripts, I mean, the thing that was quite interesting, and we were just talking about this before, and more or less unique, is the fact that it is this library-led publisher. There's sort of a lot said about the future of libraries, about the question, what is the place of libraries within universities and society more generally. And there's a lot of sort of talking about libraries and their budgets, and what they're able to get, kind of without the libraries themselves being necessarily involved in that conversation, talking about rather than talking with. So it was quite interesting to see this model of thinking, okay, here are the libraries taking a lead in getting publications, out there, in adapting to this new open access model, in adapting to some of the open access requirements that a lot of funders are putting. And so, yeah, it was, as somebody who's very much a fan of libraries. In fact, in the book, there's a lot. A lot of the book takes place within the library in the monastery, so you can hopefully see my love of the library shining through there. As somebody who is fond of libraries, I wanted to sort of see this and hope that this model is going to be a success.
Yeah, no, that's really useful to hear and interesting to hear, and I think reflects back that libraries themselves are interested in academics and feel we've got that close connection and want to know sort of how we can support and what we can do there. So it's interesting to have that direct relationship in terms of publishing. How did you find the open access publishing process? Anything particular about the sort of process of stepping through that?
I mean, I think so this is my second book, and this is the first one that's available open access, and I think it did make me think more about the range of audiences that were there. For various reasons, the first book that I have is very disciplinary in focus about the series, but also I think partly it's the fact that when you have in the back of your mind the fact that anybody could get hold of this PDF, um, that makes you think a bit more about, okay, what are the other possible audiences out there, out with anthropology, potentially out with academia, and how can I also engage with those audiences while still, at the same time making an academically rigorous and thorough job of things.
Yes, we do. We do ask a lot of authors in this context to do exactly that. So it's really interesting to hear you reflecting back on having to do that thinking. Have you any advice for colleagues, both within your discipline or kind of more broadly, who might be thinking of publishing an open access book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main thing that I've taken away from the whole process is it helps to move away from a certain kind of parochialism. I'm not trying to make bold claims for my book. It's very much, it's still quite it's still quite a technical read. It's still very, very specifically focused. But at the same time, within academia, there is this sense in which, there are certain publishers, certain series, and then certain very narrow audiences that are assumed for the books. And I think thinking about what it means to step outside of that is important. But of course, it's also worth noting that open access isn't necessarily a bed of roses. It's been interesting to see, the development of this new press, thinking through certain challenges about what kinds of license should these books be available under. How do you deal with the fact that you've got large language models hoovering up everything in sight? So, there are particular challenges to think through with that. That something being widely available is a virtue, but it comes with its own challenges to be thought through.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's brilliant to have you in conversation in this way. I think it's really important that there is that discussion in the academic community about rights and about what people are retaining or signing away, or want to retain a control over or understand where work gets used and in what way, and in what audiences, as I say, that people are trying to reach and at what time. So it's excellent to see that conversation happening. And good that that's supported in a way where people have experiences of different types of publishing, able to bring that into the conversation. I'm keen to bring Gillian into the conversation though as well, if I can, and let you ask some questions as well, maybe focusing more now towards the book itself.
Thank you, Hannah, and hello, Richard. Yeah, so the book, as Hannah's mentioned, the vow stability originates in your PhD research, but that's been expanded over time through more fieldwork and archival research. Can you just talk us through the background to the book and essentially your journey to publication?
Sure. And first of all, thanks very much to yourself, Gillian, for all of the work that you've put into getting it to this stage. It's been great to work with
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It's te frankly terrifying to think that, this is a book that's been a long time coming. It's, 20 years since I first went to Downside. And, a lot has changed in my life and in the life of the community since then. And I think that that really, what this what this is here is, on the one hand, it's an attempt to sort of think through material that I started to gather 20 years ago, and to rethink some of that in light of experience that I've had teaching, in light of experience that I've had in conversation with other anthropologists, with students, and so on, but also to think through my own, relationship with the community and downside through, through time. There's been sort of times when, the events in my life have overtaken me and I've been less in touch with them. There's been, a number of the monks who I was who were who are my closest friends are now dead. On the other hand, there was kind of, new things have happened. New things have happened there in that relationship during lockdown, especially. It was really interesting to reconnect with the monks at that time when they were expanding their digital outreach and sort of thinking, well, we're experts in social distancing in this sense, and now everybody's having to do this at the same time. What's the common ground that we can speak on there? And so that was a really interesting moment. And of course, recently their decision to leave Downside, and so making my last visit there to this place that had become so important in my life. So it sort of reflects on that kind of longer, on a slightly longer time span. But of course, as long time spans go, it's a very short time span when you consider it in relationship to the history of the community, the history of Benedictine life, of monastic life, and so in a sense, expanding that time frame that I've had with the community has sort of helped me to understand really what, on it's terrifying. 20 years is terrifying for me, but in terms of thinking about monastic history,
Yeah.
it's actually a very short, a very a blink of an eye.
I think that was something that really struck me, thinking about the more recent instability within the community following the period that you spent there, and thinking about that as a massive change and one that will, have kind of ramifications for future. But then throwing that back to think about just how long the order has been around, and that kind of puts things in a very different perspective, and it alters your view. And I think that we are so used to thinking on a really short-term basis that can often be lost. But in thinking about the changes that have happened and all how things have moved on with the community, does that instability affect your relationship to the book? And you mention, or you quote the idea of monasteries as living ruins, or are they going to evolve and move on? So is it that, as the book suggests, that monastic life is just out of fashion, or do you feel like that we're seeing a movement away from that way of life?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that became kind of obvious to me, the more I wrote this book and rethought the research material, was that I think I had followed a very domesticated idea of what stability is. What do I mean by that? So in essence, because I think partly the whole project responds to a kind of longing that I have, and I think it's a longing that a lot of people have, to find a way of thinking otherwise about the world, which isn't this world of fleeting interactions, which isn't this world where, where people are increasingly isolated, and where, sort of a world of non-places, to use Auger's term. And so, I really grabbed onto that aspect of monastic life, that, that aspect of stability. Here are people making a home, finding roots, finding roots in a rootless world, and so on. And I think that that's very important. And I think that those are values that, those are values of withdrawal from, things that we take for granted. Well, oh yeah, we should always be on the move. We should always be, that change is fundamentally a morally good thing. I think these are important things, but at the same time, I think I kind of made it too cozy. I think I'd made it in my PhD and in the way that I was thinking about it, so rooted in this idea of, living together and being able to have that sense of respite from a breathless world, that I'd missed other fundamental aspects of what stability really means. And so, especially, reworking this material, talking to the monks, thinking more about, what perseverance means. Does it mean to keep going with something in a circumstance of uncertainty? Thinking more about the fact that, intense life with the same group of people, as everybody who has a family knows, is not always cozy. It's not always a cozy life. And so thinking more about kind of the fact that that stability is this challenge that the monks are always pushing on with. And so just to tie up the sense in which at first this idea of the ends of the monastery being at downside, it seemed like, well, this is, the undermining of everything here. But the more that, I spoke to the monks about it, and the more that I reflected on it, and their note that, well, we've moved before. This is this is the fourth move in our history. And the more I had a sense that, stability was about something else. It was about, this openness to the unknown as well. And I think that sense of stability being a kind of an unsettling thing, that being a challenge rather than just this, the coziness of being rooted, was sort of reopened up by trying to think through, well, what does it mean to be stable at a time when when you are looking to the future?
I think that's a really good point, that thought of, that not being linked to place. And we know that, you explore place in the book, and that was downside was very important in the history. I thought was fascinating, actually, in terms of like how the building came about. But that notion that stability is actually being able to overcome those obstacles and move on and continue that community is really quite powerful. I think you've mentioned about the kind of ways that lifestyle opposes modern life, or many aspects of it. And I think you'd set out that one of the focus of the study was to offer a critique to the contemporary world. So asking what we can learn from a way of life that feels, very distant, I think, from the fast-paced reality that most of us experience. So I think you've probably touched on this a bit, but what struck you as the most appealing aspect of that lifestyle then? And has that changed over time as you've changed, and as you've said, started a family yourself and had all these other
Sure.
experiences join that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most fundamental thing was this importance that they place on community living and on the idea that, the moral development, that your moral development depends on having the challenge of other people, having people sort of knock the corners off of you, and that sense that living, that the more we withdraw into ourselves, the greater the temptation to being self-indulgent. And instead, the way that we learn about ourselves is sort of seeing ourselves in terms of what are we able to give to others. So all of that, was and remains really important. I think, one of the things which has probably developed in my thinking over time, and that connects with my other book on the anthropology of deep time, is the sense, and you brought this up yourself just before, the sometimes the difficulty of thinking on these longer term timescales. What are the resources that are available to us cognitively, institutionally, to think beyond the immediate present term? And I think that sense that an individual life is nested in that generational time, that that the individual is always living, and the individual is always living in the footsteps of the people who went before, and developing something in the future for future generations that you'll never meet, is a very powerful idea in monasticism. And I think that sense of how do we expand our time horizons is there in this book as it is in the Deep Time book.
As I say, that was something that really came across quite strongly in my reading. And I do think you mentioned earlier on, that it's still quite a specific and in some ways technical book, but I do think that it is really accessible. And I think, I think the great thing about open access is about extending out to other audiences. And I think there's so much that other audiences would find of interest in the book, and thoughts about different ways of life. One of the challenges, though, and I think you've mentioned yourself, a central challenge in your writing process and getting to this point with the book, has been the sort of background of the sexual abuse convictions, which Hannah mentioned in the introduction, and that precipitated the move and the closure of the school. So in chapter 8, you reflect on what you describe as the silences in your ethnographic material that haven't happened before any of this, the child sex abuse inquiry started. So I think it's kind of interesting just to think about your impression of that, a revelation post your ethnographic experience. And in chapter 8, you do undertake what I thought was a really sensitive sense-making exercise, just to piece together, relate the findings of the inquiry really to your experiences of the traditions of the Benedictine monks. So looking at things like that structure of the autonomous household, and indeed touching on celibacy across the Catholic Church. So I thought that your handling of that and exploration of that was really sensitive. And it's clear that you personally have been affected by that, that coming out, the exposure of these crimes within the community. I'm wondering, though, on a professional level, how do you feel that has impacted on your approach to ethnographic research, having to assimilate something like that?
Sure. I mean, that really one of the reasons, I'm not saying it's the only reason, partly it's my own laziness, but one of the reasons it's taken so long for the book to take this form is that the challenge of dealing with those with those convictions and with um and with the problem of child sexual abuse in the church and in the monastery, because on the one hand, it's not what I went into the monastery. I didn't go into the monastery as some kind of investigative journalist to look at those kinds of things. There's really very little in my fieldwork material that touches directly on those issues, and it's only really in the time subsequent to the fieldwork that so much of this has come out. But ultimately, I think there is the reason why it's been possible to write about this and to write about it in this way is because the community themselves have engaged in a great deal of reflection on this, that the community themselves have engaged in. There's been a lot of struggle within the community, people leaving and so on. The circumstances that led to the separation from the school, the circumstances that led to them moving moving location. And what all of that means is that the community themselves have been in this position where they are reflecting. You see that in the way that they speak at the inquiry process, but also in the general conversations that we've been able to have about this, and in the feedback that monks have given me on the draft for this, the draft of this manuscript. And so really, I think in terms of, to go to your question, what I might have learned from this as an anthropologist is that, I think that the nature of an ethical commitment within anthropology, that it's really grounded in having a certain sincerity of communication, of being able to be frank and honest with people that you're working with. I think that there is within anthropology quite often a sense of it's quite natural that if you live with people and you work with them and you build these relationships, there's that sense of affection that builds up, that sense that you become very close to them. But at the same time, that closeness also involves honesty, involves frankness. All human relations really ought to. And I think being able to grow over time into the possibility of having those kinds of frank and honest conversations, I think is quite an important thing. And I think within anthropology as a discipline, there is often a sort of a desire to keep close, to the people that you're studying, to maintain that relationship, of course. and to maintain that trust. But at the same time, you know, if a relationship can't involve critical, you know, being able to speak critically and frankly with somebody, you know, what is that relationship in the end? So I think that, you know, there is a kind of a need for anthropology to be able to speak with that kind of critical honesty, which I've attempted to do, and which, as I say, I think at this moment the monks have been very receptive to, those who have spoken to.
That's interesting. So you mention the kind of long-term ethical relationship and the importance of maintaining that. And I was interested, you know, that you had you obviously shared a draft. I wondered if there were challenges or were there any even surprises arising from that?
Yeah, so I shared the draft as a whole with two of the monks who are very kind enough to look through it and give quite detailed comments. It goes without saying. I mean, this is kind of a cliche at the beginning of books where you say, you know, all faults are my own, all interpretations in it are my own. I sort of want to make that quite clear. It's not, you know, it's not a work of co-authorship in that sense, you know. They wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that I've said within this book, and that's fine. What they did, um, I mean, they picked up on some mistakes in my Latin. First of all, that was, you know, so that was quite humbling. But in general, you know, what I thought was really helpful about it was actually they sort of pushed me. They pushed me on the interpretation of the book, on my thinking about stability, on sense of, you know, well, what is it? What is it that I'm trying to actually fundamentally say? So yeah, partly it was, you know, very helpful corrections on points of on points of detail and language, and just, you know, making sure that I'd got certain details right. But also, you know, there was this sense of, you know, okay, but so what? You know, so what? And that and especially with some of the central chapters to really, you know, push the points, the points that I was trying to make, in order to, you know, in order to really in order to make this something, in order to make this something which actually had a wider theoretical point rather than just being, okay, you've given some details about monastic life. So that was, you know, it was very helpful critical awareness from the monks. And I think it's a better book because of that. So
I think you mentioned at the beginning about the future libraries and perceptional libraries. And as a librarian, I have to say I was enormously reassured by how many references you had to the librarian and interactions
yeah.
with the librarian. So that was absolutely heartwarming for librarians to read. I think that what it struck me as well was that that you also told the story. I've started so I'll finish on this one, but that I think the librarian has now passed, or the passed
Mm.
on, the one that you were working with, and he was actually making acquisitions right up during his period in the hospital. I thought that was an enormously powerful commitment to the work and capturing that collection and in developing the collection within the monastery. So that was really quite a interesting one. On another note, I don't think there are any questions. I'm conscious that I've
Gillian,
run over the
no, that's
attributed time.
fine. I was just going to jump in and say we are working any questions that we have in that we've received through registration, or any that come in through the live Q&A as we're going. So for the audience, please do feel free to add comments to the chat or Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll continue the conversation and we'll work questions in as they come in.
Great stuff. Yeah, the other thing then, if I've still got the mic, I'll keep going. The thing that I was really curious about was how, you know, the intensity of the experience of being, you know, embedded within the monastery and working there. How do you prepare for that ending, and how is that when you then go back to normal life? I mean, you mentioned earlier about everyone having that notion or drive or desire within them just to find a more peaceful, settled space away from the constraints of life. And for me, yeah, the thought of like running away to a cave quite often occurs, I have to admit. And I think, how do you then, come out of something, engage with that and then come out of that back to the day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a general problem within anthropology. The expectation for anthropologists when they're doing their PhD was and is that there'd be this long period, at least a year of immersion in this context. And I think, historically that involved a great deal of estrangement, that you'd sort of, if you sort of think about the history of anthropology, that people would sort of sail off to the other side of the planet and be estranged from things, learn things, and then they'd come back, with these new discoveries. And I think the actual, the psychology of what that means in terms of, the estrangement, and then attempting to reintegrate yourself afterwards, has not always been something that I think we've got right, as an anthropological community. I think that that sense of students being sort of left to deal with things on their own when they're in the field, and then what do we do to sort of bring them back into the community when they're back from the field. It's been something that I've thought about a lot in terms of my own. I found it very, very difficult to readjust to life. I don't think I was particularly pleasant at the time. I think that it kind of cultivated a certain aloofness in me that didn't really work well coming back to the university. When you've sort of had this sort of thought of, sort of makes you think of lots of, you come into this mindset where you're thinking of a lot of things as quite trivial. And I think that's something that the monks work through over a lifetime, that they, that kind of aloofness, that kind of arrogance, and me sort of popping in for a year and then returning to the university thinking, oh, all of these kind of trivial things. What need have I for any of this? I don't think I was a particularly great human being to be around at the time. So it took, I think it's I think that kind of, and again, this is one of the reasons why it's taken so long. Not to make excuses. One of the reasons it's taken so long to write this book, to try and have a proper reflection of it, a proper reflective period on it, and what I've learned, and having that space for critique, including self-critique within it. But anthropology could do a lot better in terms of managing that process of estrangement and re-engagement. I think most anthropologists would agree with that.
Richard,
Thank you.
I'm going to ask something that's coming in through chat as well, but just in terms of what do the monks understand by anthropology and that term, are there any tensions in terms of you agreeing what the book is for?
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, so first of all, one of the monks did study archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge. Same degree as me. So he did. He had sort of a general sense of what it was about. I think there's a point in the book where one of the monks, this is before I went into the fieldwork, but a Benedictine monk challenged me on this idea of, how are you not just playing at being a monk? This imitation without commitment, that seemed to be sort of baked into the ethnographic method, into the participant observation. It's like, what does it really mean to sort of go through the motions of doing this for a year and then depart at the end of it? How are you really learning from that? And I think that in that sense, there was what was interesting about the process of field work, was that, for the monks there was a lot of other stuff, that was needed for conversations between us to make sense. And so the fact that I was put to doing archival research to get the proper historical grounding in that community and the congregation and Benedictine, sort of as a way that we were speaking a common language there through the historic material, a sense that I needed to be better better at speaking, about speaking about some of the theological texts, which were, part of their common conversation. So there was a lot of that sense of, it's all very well to be an anthropologist, but how are we able to speak to one another? But also within that, that sense that, this tweaking that idea of playing at being a monk, that recognition that what's actually of value here is people speaking across a kind of cultural boundary. What does it mean? What does this way of life mean to somebody who is going to go back out, back out into the world beyond the cloister? What is it that, what is that sense of the values that can be taken? And that aspect of anthropology, or that aspect of thinking about how can these values carry into an everyday world, that was very important to them. I mean, I think the sense in which anthropology was a good vehicle for doing that, yeah, the jury's still out on that one. I don't think I've made any converts to anthropology there, but
No, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think everything you're saying there about how you construct a language between parties, and then, as we're doing now, how do we then construct that as a conversation or a way of engaging and taking that forward through published format, but through events like this and this sort of discussion. It's really interesting to hear you speak. I'm going to keep going with more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
We have an audience member asking about stability as a structural, or let's say objective fact embedded in rhythms and buildings and rules, and there's a value that's actively constructed by the monks. Is there something interesting about applying that sort of double perspective?
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for that question. So one of the things which is an undercurrent in this book, and one of the things that was quite tricky managing in the peer review process, which was a very, I should say, in praise of SUP, it was a very robust peer review process, but also in my conversations with the monks, how to deal with this. So on the one hand, as in the question, you've got, and the first section, the first three chapters of the book really focus on that idea of, how is time structured, how is space structured, so that the whole of daily life is encompassed within these institutional rhythms. And that, on a institutional structural sense, is what stability consists of. That idea that, there's shared time, there's shared space. But at the same time, there was, and this point I was making before, there's also that sense of stability on a personal level, that sense of stability as perseverance, which was very important to the monks. And that was often a perseverance which was found in spaces of silence and solitude, spaces of withdrawal from the rest of the community. And so one of the things that's there in terms of that construction, these different ways of approaching stability, is that you've got this very strong communitarian value in the in stability as the rule frames it, and within these rhythms and space and so on. But you've got this this sense of what I do describe as kind of a tendency towards individualism within within the contemplative prayer of the monks, which is also part of that act of perseverance within within the way that work fits in the life of the monastery. And so there is the interesting thing there was that there was that tension within stability between this community aspect and between an individualism and an individualism which was quite a fundamental feature of English Benedictine life, and which in the chapter discussing the sex abuse scandal, that's an aspect of Benedictine life, of English Benedictine life, that the monks themselves reflect on. To what extent have we allowed individualism to kind of overshape the life of the institution? How do we find that balance? So yeah, so that was, I think, one, that in terms of that double perspective you ask there. On one hand, you have this very visible communitarian ethos. The other aspect makes plain the fact that there is quite an individualistic space, and I sort of had to, hammer my way through the peer review process to sort of make sure, that I've demonstrated that, because it's quite a, because it is such an important part of what's there in the ethnography.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And indeed, yes, our peer review process is very rigorous. So good that we're subjected to that. People are asking about the stability, and it's really interesting to hear you talk more at length about that. So you've touched on this, but another question is more from the reader's perspective about what you hope readers will take away regarding the importance of stability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that I'm hoping that the book works on a couple of different levels. I mean, really one of the reason I wanted to get it out there on a very basic level was that I wanted this material, the ethnographic material, to be out there for people to work with themselves, to think through. There's some of it that wasn't anywhere, some bits are sort of touched upon in publications, but I was starting to feel that sense of, if I died tomorrow, all of this ethnographic material is going to dissipate with me. So, I mean, that was kind of the main reason to get it out there for an anthropological audience, so that they have that material to work with. But then, and this was what the monks were really pushing me on, what is it that I want people to be able to take away about stability? What are the values? What are the values there? And I think that this point that really developed as I wrote the book more, that stability is paradoxically this can be this very unsettling thing, because whereas often, going with the flow, allowing things to change minute by minute, that can often be, that enables us to sort of accommodate ourselves to how the world is at any given moment. Actually sticking with something, sticking with people, even if you don't particularly like them, even if they've done things which are pretty horrific, sticking with a routine, even as you start to find yourself bored by it, sticking with this question of how do we live as a community, even if we're not going to live in these places. There were all of these quite unsettling moments where it's like, actually, stability is this, is this hard challenge through which we don't take ourselves for granted. We're always having to ask, well, what is the purpose of this? What is the purpose of the life that we've chosen for ourselves? And thinking about that in relation to not just your own lifespan, but ultimately the lifespan of the whole institution, and obviously within the framework of Catholic belief, of Christian belief, they're thinking about that in relation to eternity. Then, and thinking, and so that opening scene in the book where I'm looking at the monk in their solemn profession, acting out their death, lying on the funeral, it's this funerary ritual. It's that confrontation with something that we all have to confront, which is, what is the purpose of a short human life in the face of the span of eternity. And that's quite an unsettling question when you ask it that way.
And a striking start to the book, as you're outlining there, for anybody that's downloading it and reading it, is a sort of excellent way to work into what you go on to look at. We have another question about the idea that you've touched on about coming back out of that process and that field work and settling back down into academic life. Was there anything from the monks that you then tried to keep in mind that you had brought with you from that experience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, one thing, the thing that comes to mind straight away, and this is in one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 6, is the practice of Lectio Divina. Practice, slow contemplative reading of scripture as an act of prayer. And I think that was a very interesting, for somebody who was sort of, doing the thing in a university context where you're sort of taking lots of texts and trying to get through them as quickly as possible and then mash them up into some kind of literature review or essay or that kind of thing. And of course, now one could outsource that whole mashing up process to a large language model if one so chooses.
The far end of the scale from AI summary.
Yeah.
They want to give
So,
us all kinds of scholarly texts now.
So moving from that to this insistence that I had to read slowly. You know, as I say, it was quite a physiologically hard thing to sort of slow down the eye movement, to sort of slow down the thought process there. And I think that that act of, you know, that's something, you know, it's one of these things which I, you know, quite frequently lose sight of, that importance of slow reading, and then sort of have to make that sort of conscious effort. To draw myself back to, so I mention it in that blog post where I say, you know, why is it that I think it's quite important that SUP is, you know, also doing physical books? It's because I think partly that sense of working with the physical book, of the, you know, of letting the page act on you is a very different process of gradual reading and of listening to the text than if you're sort of scrolling up and down a PDF or hitting, you know, hitting Control F and you know, find a particular keyword, or that it's, you're working through something differently. So so I think that that was quite important. And also, you know, the general sense that if there's not a moral purpose to what you're doing in academic life, then why are you doing it at all? Sort of that sense of, you know, what is your vocation in all of this? That's, you know, that's always been quite an important question to me, and it was kind of rammed home by the experience of being with the monks.
Yeah. Another question we have is how would you address the perception that choosing stability means settling or giving up on opportunities in some way?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that I think partly what it comes down to, I mean, it's touched upon in the book, but I'm writing about this in more detail now. But this, you know, the sense of Durkheim talks about anomie as being this sort of sense of this infinity of possibilities, and it's kind of like this thing which never slakes your thirst, because you're always, you know, I'm doing this, but could I be doing this other thing, or could I be doing this other thing? And one of the things that means is that you never particularly sit with the circumstances that you're placed in. So what do I mean by that? I mean, quite simply, rather than having that sense of I, as an individual agent, can move through this world of infinite possibilities on my own terms, what does it mean to be with the circumstances that you find yourself in and have to think about, okay, how do I act how do I act and grow, knowing that it's not just on my own terms, but on the terms of other people, that I don't have that infinite range of possibilities, that I have to think about what it means to live with and through others. Then in a sense, that's that's a kind of, you know, that's what I mean about it being this challenge of stability, this kind of unsettling thing, because it's quite easy to dodge that question if you're thinking, or I could just do something else, or maybe it'd just be better to go somewhere else, or, you know, I don't like it so much here. To actually have to say, you know, here are the challenges that people are placing upon me. How can I respond to them? You know, I don't think that's settling. I think that's quite the opposite. It's, you know, it's not giving yourself the opportunity to flee.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent answer. Thank you, Richard. I'm conscious of time a little bit, so I'm going to bring this to a close. I will say that we're getting compliments as well as questions through on the Q&A, so that's excellent. We'll tell you those later. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody's input there. Let me just say a little bit by way of closing. First of all, with a few thank yous. Thank you to Gillian for co-hosting this event and guiding that discussion. Always excellent questions. And to colleagues as well who facilitated this event and supported the publishing process, including Dominique Walker and Paul Clark and Jennifer Loudon. Incredible thanks to all of our audience for registering, for attending, and asking such interesting questions that have really allowed us to grill you a bit, Richard, and find out more and hear more from you. That's been excellent. Thank you to yourself, Richard, for sharing both insight and experience, but really guiding us through that ethnographic perspective and what that felt like, both in terms of the field work and afterwards and in the writing. And of course, the book itself, The Vow of Stability, is available open access now from the SUP website, sup.ac.uk. You can read online, you can download as a PDF or an EPUB for book readers. As Richard mentioned, you can also purchase a paperback or hardback copy if that's a preference from all normal retailers, and for library colleagues from standard vendor options as well, of course. We have other books available openly from sup.ac.uk, so please do take a look. We're also open to submission from authors. There's some great resources on the website to answer questions and guide through the submission process. We're now accepting submissions from across the UK. And we have a new programme for open access textbooks as well. So if you're watching and you think this may be relevant to your own writing or academic work, then please do get in touch. And of course, we have opportunities for peer reviewers and academic supporters of the press as well. But as we close today, I think we've learned more about the type of fieldwork that underpins this book, the discipline context as a whole, and you spoke about new reflections about how stability comes not from that lack of change, but from overcoming challenges. Was really really interesting to hear how your perspective had changed on that over time, Richard, and I think something that many of us might reflect more on in different contexts as well. I was very struck by the idea of condensing this whole history of monastic life into a relationship that for yourself was over a really long time frame, but then condensed down further into the book. I feel slightly bad that we've compressed that further into a single hour that we've spent today. But I do hope that everybody that has registered, that is attending now or is listening or watching later, has enjoyed the conversation, and it has given an hour within people's day to step away from our own fast-paced realities that I think we all encounter or suffer from perhaps, but to think about different perspectives on daily life and on ritual. I hope that people do download and share the book and enjoy extending this conversation further. And that the book achieves what you referenced at the very beginning of our conversation about making full-length ethnographies more easily and fairly available to students and scholars. I'm excited for you, Richard, and to see the book picked up in the way that it has been in the first couple of days, and that extends further and beyond this conversation. But let me just close there by saying thank you again, and thank you to everybody that's been watching online. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.